Chainalysis, if you're not familiar, it's a relatively small company, or 300 or so employees, and we're really involved in kind of creating tools that allow the cryptocurrency kind of businesses to exist. And that's like exchanges and financial institutions that have a stake in cryptocurrency assets. And then also the investigators that are dealing with problems involving stolen cryptocurrency and ransomware, child sex abuse material that's sold using cryptocurrency, and all sorts of things. And I love to point out, after having said something like that, that our economists at Chainalysis have done an extensive analysis about the use of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin specifically, and have found that only about 1% or so of Bitcoin transactions are related to crime of one sort or another. And so if your experience with cryptocurrency is really like reading in the news, you might think that the purpose of Bitcoin is really just to facilitate crime, and that's really not the case. It has lots and lots of different purposes, that many of which are sort of like human interest stories and remitting payments across borders, and moving your sort of wealth out of a country that has a despotic government that will run the banks and things like that. So we're really happy to have a role to play in enabling trust in cryptocurrency that allows it to be used for all sorts of benign things, as well as having a really important behind the scenes role in informing law enforcement and regulators about the problems that often lead to enforcement actions that I'll get to talk about here in a bit. Yeah, so if you haven't looked into cryptocurrency tracing, one thing you might know already about Bitcoin and blockchain in general is that everything is sort of public, right? Every address and every transaction and the size of that transaction and the number of Bitcoin is public, and everybody can go and look at that and see all the information that's available from the very beginning of Bitcoin. And so you might think, well, why would we need to do anything beyond searching the blockchain for information about a problem? The reason is that these addresses that are on the blockchain are not super helpful at identifying who received Bitcoin. Unless they share their address online, the chances are that you're not going to know who that is. And so that's really our main purpose, and the sort of thing that we deliver to customers who like us is this sort of clustering together these addresses into something that resembles a wallet, or what we call a cluster or an entity. And that entity has a name, like an exchange like Coinbase or Binance or Bitstamp, Coinify, a payment processor, all sorts of different things. And when it comes to ransomware, that's really powerful. And so here's a really sweet graphic to show that we're serious about presenting to the group today. Just showing the different kinds of entities that we'll label. And, just to point out that we wouldn't necessarily have a label that just says fraud shop. That would be more like a category. And instead, the entity would be labeled something very specific, like UAS, or, Brian's Club, for stolen credit cards and that sort of thing. So. Yeah, here's our sort of timeline of disruption, and I love talking about this. And I've not been at Chainalysis long, but I've been using Chainalysis products for years, and had a small behind-the-scenes role to play in SamSam ransomware there in 2018, and really worked with a big group of people to sort of learn everything that we could about it and identify the sort of places where the cryptocurrency ended up, and that ended up being part of an enforcement action. I'm really, really proud to have this sort of behind the scenes role there in that. And then we're also involved in all sorts of other things. Anything that you read about in the news that involves sanctions or some enforcement, indictment, criminal complaints, all sorts of things, if it has a cryptocurrency nexus, there's a pretty good chance that somebody from Chainalysis contributed to that in some way, or the people responsible for delivering that enforcement action might have used our tools independently. Yeah. Yeah, so I probably don't need to point out that the trend is increasing when it comes to ransomware. And that's true in both the size of the payments and the kind of overall volume of cryptocurrency that's being paid to ransomware groups, as well as the frequency of incidents. And so we read a lot in the news about these really high impact ones, but there's also a lot of very small ransomware groups out there that would target a single computer, and the ransom might be hundreds or a few $1,000s instead of these multi-million ransoms that we read about in the news almost every day now. Yeah, so the one thing my notes aren't showing up here now. Let me see if I can expand this real quick. Yeah, so one thing I wanted to point out here is that the ransomware ecosystem in most cases, and especially those where they have the high impact cases that you read about in the news involving hospital networks and critical infrastructure, municipal government, all sorts of really significant victims there. Those tend to involve a sort of supply chain of service providers and criminal enterprises that bring all sorts of specialty services into this one incident that ends up costing millions of dollars. I heard another presenter explain that the cost of the ransom might be 5 million, but the impact might be 100 million or more, right? And so there's a benefit for the ransomware criminals to sort of find these specialists and increase the likelihood that they are going to get paid, and also to push that message that the cost of recovery would be much higher than just paying the ransom. So, some elements of that criminal supply chain are selling compromised credentials, typically for Microsoft RDP accounts, also Citrix, and remote management tools that are used in a sort of cloud management environment, and VPN to a certain extent, but maybe largely the largest part of that being RDP and Citrix. And then there's also a criminal element that will evaluate hundreds of already compromised environments. Like they might buy a bunch of RDP accounts, sift through all of these accounts and find the best ones that they think are most likely to pay a ransom, and then sell that into a ransomware group or affiliate that will kind of take over that access and turn it into a ransomware incident. There's also criminal elements that do nothing but malspam and send malware, this sort of initial foothold or loader malware into pretty much anybody connected to the internet. It's not specifically targeted, but tends to hit most in wealthier countries that where the likelihood of monetizing access to that compromised computer is higher. And so they will sell access to ransomware affiliates as well. So we already have some malware like Zloader installed on a machine, and a ransomware crew might look through the panel of available Zloader bots and say, "Oh, this belongs to some mega corporation. Let's go ahead and choose that one and use ransomware on it." Yeah, then the sort of pen testers, this is a kind of euphemism used in crime forums to describe the people who actually do all the post-exploitation activities. So we have that access to a criminal, or access to a corporate victim environment, and the pen testers, they're called, will go in, escalate privileges, get admin rights in a Windows domain, enumerate all the assets, delete backups, and then eventually take a payload from the ransomware crew and deploy that to every machine in the enterprise. And then there's often, in the larger ransomware operations, a separate crew that manages negotiation around the clock. So if there's a requirement for the victim to communicate with the ransomware operators, that's often the responder to that negotiation is often somebody who's operating as a service to that ransomware crew, like either text chat in English, or sometimes even over the phone. They might make phone calls to a victim to kind of remind them of the seriousness of this ransomware incident, and to encourage them to pay. And I'll say too, this we call this a supply chain, but it's really more of a pyramid scheme or something like an MLM, where the very large base at the bottom of this pyramid is made up of people who make a pretty small amount of money. They're recovering their cost, and then not making a sort of living wage. They're certainly not wealthy. It might be extra money for them if they have a regular job, often in IT or as a developer. And then only at the very, very top of the pyramid do we see people making, sort of Lambo money and spending it on $600 slip-on Gucci shoes and things like that we laugh about internally. So I like showing this slide here where it shows the cyber kill chain, which, for network defenders, we know that, not most incidents don't follow this chain perfectly linear and in order. But for us at Chainalysis, we like to point out that our visibility gives us insight into multiple sort of links in the chain. And so whenever a ransomware crew or an affiliate buys tools or malware, they're buying machines that are already compromised. They're often recruiting on crime forums, and in order to do so, they have to fund an account on that crime forum. Sometimes up to $1 million will be sent to a crime forum to sort of support their selling and recruiting activities in escrow. And then buying, selling compromised credentials, paying ransoms. We get to see that, of course. And then maybe more importantly, from an enforcement aspect, we're seeing the ransom payments getting distributed to affiliates and their service providers. And then finally, laundering the cryptocurrency and exchanging it for sometimes other digital currencies or a fiat at an exchange. So. I'll say one thing that, most of my career has been spent in computer network defense and kind of a SOC environment. And I'll say it's pretty frustrating that our industry hasn't really come up with great frameworks and approaches for dealing with ransomware in a more direct or specific way. And I think a lot of the reason for that we're still seeing an increase, even though we're all very much aware of this problem, is that the guidance that we're given as network defenders and managers and CISOs, it's not very specific. We hear the same sort of list of good security hygiene practices: update antivirus, patch vulnerabilities, don't open attachments. And I don't want to make it sound like that's bad advice. It's good advice, but it's not really specific enough to help somebody protect themselves against ransomware. And like I'll say too, that large enterprises, they're not getting ransomware because they didn't update their antivirus. They're getting it because the antivirus didn't work, or in many cases, it was disabled before it ever had an opportunity to detect some kind of malware in the first place, right? So, I'll say another thing that we often hear from ransomware victims is that they had great backups. They had, a tested, resilient backup system for their environment with priorities and classification and everything, but they never anticipated having to restore all of it at one time. And to say that not only that, but we have to rebuild the operating system, install and configure the software, and then restore the data from our backup system. And so that process often takes so long that the damage is too critical or too impactful for them to not consider paying the ransom. So Chainalysis, I'll say, like, it's a fantastic place to work if you're interested in ransomware, because we're getting information from all sorts of collection partners, incident response firms, victims directly. And we also conduct our own internal research that involves malware analysis and sort of monitoring criminal environments and forums. And all of that, I'll say, leads me to get, like maybe come up with some lessons learned over the last couple of years that, if there was a short list that we had to create of advice to protect against ransomware, maybe first on the list would be, fixing Microsoft Office macro security so that documents and spreadsheets that arrive into the environment aren't allowed to run. Like we don't even want the user to have the capability to make a bad decision there. So take away the macros altogether and maybe only allow those that are produced internally or digitally signed to run in the environment. I'd also say a very close second would be to carefully scrutinize all of the remote access methods, but especially RDP and Citrix. And if you have these systems and VPNs and other ways to sort of get into the network, they have to have 2FA, like there can't be any exception to that. And if you have to expose RDP or Citrix, they're often used for specific business cases, maybe for a service provider or ISV that's delivering support for a system remotely. And in those cases, I'd say like limit the IP addresses that can reach that RDP service, and then you can have a little bit of breathing room there from a risk sort of surface footprint kind of perspective. Then the same thing I'll say for cloud managed RMMs, like we've heard about Kaseya, and Synoptek was another one that happened, very similar kind of thing where the remote management software that's managed in a cloud service accounts for that service were compromised, and then all of the customers using that management service have ransomware deployed to them as if it's a normal kind of software update or deployment package. And so if you use one of these services like that, we have to very, very carefully protect those accounts and make sure 2FA or we're using some kind of SSO so that when an admin leaves the environment, their access goes with them. So going into more of the cryptocurrency tracing information, I'll say here's an example from our main kind of flagship investigation tool called Reactor. And you can see that each one of these circles represents a cryptocurrency kind of wallet, I guess, which is really a collection of addresses that are involved in sending and receiving Bitcoin in these cases. And they all have names that tell us that on the left there's different ransomware families, and all of those have paid for bulletproof hosting, services that don't respond to legal requests or takedown requests from industry partners. And that will allow the criminal infrastructure or the malware infrastructure to remain resilient for a longer period of time. So some examples there: FlowSpec and Yalashanda. And then the chart on the right shows some examples where ransomware family or ransomware crews are paying into malware as a service, which might be loader malware like CACBot or Zloader. Redline now gets bundled with a separate loader, and also stealing credentials that feed this ransomware supply chain as well. Pretty interesting. So initial access brokers, I'll say that's one of the really important parts of what I'm spending my time on at Chainalysis, because it's a really vulnerable part of the criminal supply chain for ransomware, where somewhat, I would say, less sophisticated actors, they're not necessarily stupid or anything. They might be just people who are competent enough to gain access to a victim corporate environment or municipal government or something like that, but they're not well connected enough in the crime forums and so forth to monetize that access. And so what happens is they'll find these kind of lucrative targets and then make a sales post on a crime forum that offers RDP accounts to megacorp for anywhere from hundreds of dollars to a few thousand each. and sometimes they'll be bundled together in groups. And so you'll see, hey, here's 35 Citrix accounts in the different corporate environments, and I'll sell that for $75,000. Or, that's a pretty typical kind of post from initial access brokers like Fuble, who posts on the main Russian language forum called exploit.in. I'll say another thing about these sales posts, and that's the description of the victim organization is often based on Zoom info, and it's almost always Zoom info specifically where we find the information that describes the number of employees, the annual revenue, and maybe the industry is sometimes also included in the sales post. And the revenue is important, I'll say, because that's often the trigger or kind of deciding point for where the ransom itself will start. And many of the ransomware groups will take 1% of that annual revenue that's described in Zoom info, and that's the ransom starting point where you could begin negotiating, or maybe not in some cases. Following that up about the less sophisticated actors here, initial access brokers are often much easier to identify. Like their real world identity and their location. And the ransomware crews, like the core groups of affiliates and developers, are often located in places where we wouldn't expect to find law enforcement cooperation. But the initial access brokers, they're often in places where we do have a history of cooperation there, and arrests and meaningful kind of activity and enforcement actions taking place there. Yeah. So affiliates, there are a lot of people who make who will write endlessly about the different things that ransomware affiliates post in crime forums about their loyalty or affiliation to specific ransomware programs. But for the most part, they go where the money is. And we see them posting things about how certain ransomware families are better than others. They encrypt faster. The speed is one of the most important things to ransomware affiliates, because they want to make sure that all of the assets that they've compromised, have every file that they can reach locked before the victim has a chance to kind of disrupt the activity. And so the speed is very important. And that's one thing they'll complain about or sort of promote in their own posts about ransomware. I'll also say that, we learn a lot about these affiliates and their loyalties from disputes that take place on crime forums, where one crime forum member might say, hey, this jerk owes me $100,000 because he messed up our Conti sort of ransomware incident, or the thing that we were working on together. And as part of this dispute, it takes place in the forums. They'll post chat logs and other kinds of information that reveals a lot about how they conduct their operations. And so we get to see actors like with the name Fantastic Fedora, who talks about leaving Maze and joining Conti and all sorts of things like that. It happens all the time, and it's hard to say one affiliate is associated with one ransomware. They change pretty regularly, and here's an example of where some affiliates are bouncing around to different ones, right? Yeah, a lot is made about Monero and the ability to sort of protect anonymity and OPSEC on behalf of the criminals. And there's definitely a trend toward demanding ransom payments in Monero. If you're not familiar, compared to Bitcoin, which we say is high KYC, or we get to know a lot about the customers who are using Bitcoin, because we can cluster together all of their activity and identify new addresses because of that. Monero, on the other hand, has a lot of privacy features that make that much, much more complicated. And so many of the ransomware crews, like REvil, Conti, and what's the one here? That's REvil. They demand the ransom in XMR Monero first. And it's often the case that the victim will come into the chat with them and start negotiating and saying, hey, we don't have a way to get $5 million worth of Monero because no US or EU based exchange is going to trade $5 million in fiat for $5 million worth of Monero because that would be a compliance issue for them. And so they'll end up negotiating the ransom in Bitcoin, which they can get in a short period of time and high volumes. And then the 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 ransomware actors will charge them a premium for using Bitcoin, sometimes as much as 20%. So they're trying to really hard to encourage victims to pay in Monero, but it doesn't seem to be all that effective. We know it happens from talking to our collection partners, but it's not. It's a really small percentage of the overall volume of kind of crime activity and ransomware, as well as all the supply chain activity that we talked about there. Yeah, so this is the best part of what we do, when we can tell this full story from beginning to end in a ransomware incident. Either it comes to us from a customer or public sector partner, or we read about it in the news sometimes and are able to do our own research to find our way into the payments that are being made facilitating ransomware. And we can see that really the most important part here is over on the right side, where we can see all the different services that get paid in the process of facilitating a single ransomware incident. And some of these, like cloud storage, are really significant, and we recognize that internally at Chainalysis that we have to know about all these legitimate services as well. Like people pay for Proton Mail accounts, they pay for Mega.nz accounts, they pay for pCloud and all kinds of other services, domain registration in Bitcoin. And so we have to have a cluster labeled for each one of these services there. And it's really powerful when it works this way, that we can tell this whole story of the financing of a ransomware incident from the very beginning, the initial access broker, sometimes even before that, to say somebody purchased accounts from crime markets like UAS, and that's where the initial access broker sort of found their way into the victim network. So yeah, pretty fantastic stuff there. Yeah, here's a similar example there where, where do the funds end up? I'll say one thing, a lot of people talk about or project their own ideas of how a crime should work on criminals. And we shouldn't I don't think we should do that. I think we should just look at the evidence that's in front of us, and we have a whole long history of examples to draw upon to understand the pattern of behavior for criminals using cryptocurrency and malware and other things. And we don't need to invent new scenarios. And one of the things that we hear is, oh, a criminal would never spend directly to a compliant exchange. But this happens all the time. And each time this happens, it's sort of a law enforcement lead for us that we can kind of point out and make available to people who can do something meaningful with it. But yeah, there's a range of discipline when it comes to all sorts of things, from protecting the criminal's identity and over to laundering their funds, or protecting the source of their money, or how they get local currency from the Bitcoin that they received from a ransom. There's a wide range of discipline there, and some criminals will spend directly to an exchange, like we see here. Yeah, so the major goal here, if you haven't picked up on it, is that we're trying to trace the cryptocurrency to a point where we can unmask the criminals when they cash out. Or in some cases, it might even be possible to seize the assets before they're laundered, and maybe give those back to a victim. That's happened in a couple of cases. It's not real common, but unmasking the criminal who's behind an account at a compliant cryptocurrency exchange is something that happens frequently and can lead to lots of different international law enforcement actions that are pretty cool. You might not know that there's a real significant burden on exchanges that operate in the US and EU, and for that matter, most other countries, to comply with international laws on money laundering. And so the ones that are used by criminals, like they know not to use Coinbase and US-based crypto exchanges, but they often are using foreign exchanges that will happily cooperate with a legal request. And so it's an interesting thing to see this sort of pattern of behavior happening over and over that leads to helpful results for law enforcement and victims as well. Yeah, so I've got one case study here. We could easily have a case study for every single major ransomware that you've ever heard of as it relates to cryptocurrency, because we can spot these same sort of payments and the supply chain activity in every single one. But one really interesting one, and that's kind of recent, is a NetWalker. And if you're not familiar, this is a pretty successful one, 78 million in ransom proceeds. And to put that into perspective, by comparison, Ryuk took in about 150 million before it stopped operating earlier this year. And 200 million maybe around the kind of ceiling for what we have observed for ransomware crews. But it's a fantastic amount of money, and one that's almost hard to imagine. Back to my pyramid scheme analogy before, it's a really small number of people who are really collecting most of that money. Yeah, so the last bullet there is important too. Lots of ransomware crews will state in their recruiting posts and posts about their ransomware programs that they won't target healthcare or government or critical infrastructure, all sorts of conditions on it. But all that, that they're just saying that for to make it, because they know that people like me and us will read that and say, oh, like maybe there's a chance that it won't happen again, where a hospital gets ransom locked. But what seems to be the case is that when they're faced with an opportunity to collect a large ransom, millions of dollars, they're going to take it. And then we've seen this pattern happen over and over again, without exception to any specific ransomware program. Yeah, so the disruption part of this is pretty cool, where the money launderer involved in this NetWalker ransomware program was Canadian and able to be identified through trading activity and other kinds of identity details and legal requests. And then that had a really positive impact, including seizing $500,000 that were directly sort of planned or in the queue for laundering by this Canadian national. So yeah, pretty cool stuff there. I really like this slide here, sort of showing the places where we can help with a ransomware event. What typically happens when a victim makes a payment is it's often, first of all, facilitated by what's called a recovery company, Kovler being one of the best known recovery companies, but a lot of incident response firms that are typically involved in all sorts of general incident response. They might make ransom payments on behalf of victims as well. These are companies that hold a large amount of crypto assets so that they can kind of pull a lever and make that payment without having to go through the trouble of KYC and all the vetting that would be required to purchase $5 million worth of Bitcoin or Monero. And yeah, so internally at Chainalysis, we'll make a graph for each one of these events and try to find the place where they cash out. And often that involves quite a lot of analysis to find a sort of common cash out point or to identify the payments that are made to affiliates. Some ransomware groups do this very consistently, and others they're sort of all over the place in how much they pay or what percentage they're paying to affiliates that are involved. Yeah, so then we might reach out to an exchange that could be a customer or just sort of a cooperating partner, and say that, hey, here's an example where we've analyzed this chain of events and know that this deposit to your service involves ransomware payment, and then hopefully in the end the ransomware crews will not be able to take out that cryptocurrency from the exchange, and they'll have to find other ways to launder their money. So yeah, so I've got my email here. My name is Brian Carter. I've kind of split my career working as an intelligence analyst and then more recently in computer network defense. And I'll say I think I have one of the best jobs in the industry at Chainalysis, where I get to sort of be part intelligence analyst and part kind of adversary ransomware sort of researcher, and love the aspect of kind of being able to help people disrupt this really terrible cycle of compromise. And I hope this presentation has been useful to you. And if you have an interest in cryptocurrency, ransomware specifically, anything that you don't, just want to reach out and ask a question, feel free to email me. I'm not in sales, and I promise I won't like drop your name into Salesforce or something and commit you to a lifetime of, email contacts and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Hey, Brian, thank you so much for this. You sounded exactly like Kim, so that was great.
Yeah,
So we
I
have
don't look like her.
we have some questions here. From a risk assessor analyst perspective, is there a risk assessment framework that you would recommend for blockchain technology?
Uh, yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it really depends on the application. If you mean blockchain, like non-traditional uses of blockchain, I'm not sure I understand the question, but um, for non-traditional uses, I think the main benefit of blockchain is when it's decentralized, and a lot of the proposals I've seen for non-traditional blockchain technology don't really leverage that benefit. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer than
No, I
that.
mean, I haven't seen many standards when it comes to blockchain analysis itself. So,
Uh,
I mean, I remember going to Hackers on Planet Earth, Hope, wow, 6 years ago, and they were talking about de-anonymization and tracking. So, that's
oh yeah, for Bitcoin specifically, yeah. So there's a handful of companies that do what Chainalysis does. I think what not to be a sales pitch here, but what really led me to become a Chainalysis customer years ago was that the likelihood of finding a named entity in there instead of just an address or a hash, right? And that's what makes it useful, really. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. But there's other companies out there that compete with us.
let's see. Are ransomware as a service operators an extension of organized crime syndicates such as EOC, which is the Eurasian or Russian organized crime, or are they purely independent operators?
Yeah, I think they're so a lot of people would call it organized crime, sort of independent of other more traditional organized crime involving human trafficking and drugs and other things like that. I'm not aware of any specific connections to these more traditional organized crime networks, but there's a lot of research that suggests that one ransomware crew or malware crew really called Evil Corp is connected to the FSB in Russia, and that's maybe the closest analog to respond to that question. I hope that helps.